Hello there, I'm solicitor Trevor Cooper. This talk is being filmed in the week commencing the 8th of December 2014, and it's intended to be a guide on the law and practice on the identification of dogs and the proposed compulsory microchipping, which is due to come into force in England in 2016. Currently, microchipping is only required for prescribed types of dogs, such as a pit bull terrier type, as part of the exemption process. It's also required for lawfully docked dogs, for racing greyhounds, and it's required for compliance with the pet travel scheme. However, many owners have already taken advantage of the benefits of getting their dog microchipped now, before it becomes a legal requirement. The Welsh Government remains committed to introducing a version themselves, but at the time of filming this talk, their regulations aren't completed and the commencement date is uncertain. No decision has yet been made by Scotland. On the other hand, Northern Ireland has been leading the way in the UK, as they've had compulsory microchipping in place since the 9th of April 2012. For England, the draft regulations were initially laid before Parliament on the 28th of October 2014, but these were withdrawn and relayed, slightly amended, on the 11th of December 2014. Yes, that's happened during the week we've been filming, so it's kept me on my toes. If there should be any changes, or perhaps I should say if there should be any more changes, I'll make sure that they're reflected in the notes. You may also want to follow me on Twitter, where I'll post up any relevant information. The Twitter name is @DogLawUK. Don't worry, I don't tweet what I've had for tea, nor my opinion on the latest person being evicted from Big Brother or from the jungle. To a dog owner, their pet is part of the family. And regardless of whether it's a championship-winning pedigree dog, or if it's a lovable mongrel from a rescue, or it might even be one of those fancy-fangled designer dogs with a made-up name, owners want to make sure they don't lose their much-loved pet. But if the dog should become lost, then owners will want to ensure that it can be returned quickly and easily. In law, a dog is regarded as a chattel, it's an item, it's a thing. It has no higher status than this tie or even this waistcoat. Talking of which, can I point out this waistcoat's new? And for those of you who follow my talks, you'll be pleased to see you don't need sunglasses to watch me today. Anyway, back to dogs. We don't have a national register of dog owners, and there is no one single piece of evidence that conclusively proves who owns a dog. All we can do is to piece it together from all of the available evidence. This can include things such as the sales receipt, any forms given by the rehoming centre, the microchip, a tattoo, kennel club registration certificate, maybe the veterinary records, insurance details, as well as perhaps the practical arrangements for who has day-to-day charge of the dog. In the event of a dispute on who owns a dog, a civil court can be asked to make a declaration, in which case they will sift through the available evidence and attach such weight as they deem fit to each part. Separate out in your minds a couple of concepts. The keeper, the person who's got possession of the dog, may be a different person from the owner. And if a dog goes missing, then I want it to be returned back to its home. And for me, that means it should go back to the person who is the habitual keeper. That is, the person who normally has charge of the dog. The draft microchipping regulations in England refer to that keeper as being the person with whom the dog normally resides. There's no legal definition of a stray dog, but it seems to me that if a dog is away from home without someone in charge of it, then it's probably going to be a stray dog. Dogs Trust commissions a stray dog survey every year to get an idea of trends in the numbers of stray dogs. Now, when I was a child, going back a few years, there were feral dogs, so dogs that lived in the streets. But thankfully, this is now very much a rarity. And so nowadays, the stray dogs we have are by and large those that have just escaped from home. The general view of the public is that the stray dog problem has disappeared because most people don't see them. Yet, do the statistics bear this out? No, they don't. The most recent survey was published in September 2014, and it sets out the figures for stray dogs collected by councils across the United Kingdom. There was a response rate of 90%, so 90% of the councils responded to the Dogs Trust request for that survey. So the figures can be relied on as being a fair reflection on what councils are actually doing. Naturally, it doesn't take into account any stray dogs that may have been returned home direct by a finder, perhaps because the dog had a collar and tag, more on that later. Nor will it include those where perhaps a vet's practice or a rescue has been able to trace the dog's owner via a microchip or a tattoo. But based on all 359 authorities who responded to that Dogs Trust survey, there was a 1% decrease in the number of strays handled by councils. Well, hurrah. However, this still meant that the numbers were a whopping 110,675, and that represents one stray dog for every 571 people. Around half of the stray dogs were reunited with their owners. Well, hurrah. But then you stop and think and then realise that the other half didn't get back home. So either a new home had to be found for them, or they were sadly put to sleep. Indeed, about 7% of all stray dogs picked up by councils in the UK were put down. Now, I appreciate that some of them may have been sick dogs, some may have been dangerous dogs, but even so, not all of them. By law, every local authority must have an officer who deals with stray dogs, but their responsibilities can be delegated to others. The officer on the ground who goes out to collect the dogs is sometimes called the dog warden, but they may have a different job title, and it could even be a third-party contractor. But for convenience, I shall call that person the dog warden in this talk today. There's no statutory obligation on a council to have a 24/7 stray dog collection service, and some will only operate Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, so during office hours. Now, that would be fine if dogs only went missing during office hours. Outside of those hours, councils should, where practicable, have an acceptance point where a finder can take a stray dog. Under section 149, subsection 3 of the Environmental Protection Act from 1990, where the dog warden finds a stray dog, he shall, if practicable, seize the dog and detain it. If the dog's owner is known, the legal requirement is for the council to serve a notice stating that the dog may be disposed of unless the owner claims it within 7 clear days and pays the council's expenses. If the owner hasn't come forward after 7 clear days from the date of seizure or service of the notice, whichever's the later, then the dog can be put to sleep or sold or given away to a member of the public or to a rehoming centre. If the dog is rehomed, then by operation of section 149, subsection 7, the original owner's rights are extinguished. And that's even if the dog has escaped completely by accident, and even if the owner is away, leaving somebody else in charge of that dog. Of course, finders keepers doesn't apply, and so if a finder takes possession of a stray dog, then under section 150 subsection 1, they must forthwith either return the dog to its owner or take the dog to the council. So how would you know where a stray dog's home is? I mean, it's going to be important for a finder for them to work out where the dog should be returned to, or important for a dog warden who needs to know where they can serve a notice. Well, I suppose you could ask the dog, but you'd look pretty stupid and you wouldn't necessarily understand the answer the dog may give you. The law currently requires the owner to take responsibility for identifying their dog, and it's through the collar and tag. That law is contained in the Control of Dogs Order 1992. Subject to very limited exemptions under Article 2, subsection 1. Every dog, while in a highway or a place of public resort, so basically when it's out, it shall wear a collar with the name and address of the owner inscribed on that collar or on a plate or badge attached to it. Now, most people who comply with this law do so by using a tag that attaches to the collar. But it seems to me that generally compliance is woeful. Failure to comply without lawful authority or excuse is a criminal offence under the Animal Health Act 1981, and an owner or the person in charge of the dog is liable to a fine of up to £5,000. But prosecutions are rare. The biggest downside is that an owner is reducing the chances of a lost dog being returned. Unusually, the order makes it clear that it can only be enforced by the council, and so the police have no enforcement role. A collar and tag that conforms to this law makes it easy for a dog warden or a finder to see who the dog belongs to and where the dog needs to be returned to, without having to rely on any equipment such as a scanner, a sat-nav or a computer. They can just use their eyes. So for this reason, a tag should be every dog owner's first line of defence to get a lost dog back home. So what should go on the tag? The law says name and address of the owner, but it doesn't define what this means. I have my own interpretation that may help you, so let's have a look at 3 examples of a tag for a dog owned by an entirely fictitious lady. We'll call her Camilla. Now, in this example, it's got the dog's name, Tricky Woo. Now, this is the wrong information. Well, it might be the right dog's name, but it's the wrong information to go on the tag, as it should be the owner's name, not the dog's name. It's also got a phone number. Well, a phone number isn't an address. It may be that at some future stage Parliament will change this, but currently it is the address that's required. By all means, put your phone number on it as well, but it shouldn't replace the requirement for an address. Let's look at another example. Well, on this one, it's got part of the address. But in my opinion, just having the house number and postcode really isn't enough. I appreciate that some sat-navs may allow this to pinpoint some addresses, but this doesn't apply every time. And of course, you're relying on the finder having access to a sat-nav. Say, for example, you've just moved, you're having a housewarming party, and you've decided to invite me to come along, and believe me, I can be a bit of fun at a party after a couple of sherries. So you want me to come, you ring me and I confirm, hurrah, I'm available, and I'll be thrilled to come. And I then ask you for your address. Now, there's absolutely no way you're just going to give me your house number and postcode, are you? I would expect to see on the tag the house name or number, the road name and the town. That's my interpretation of address, plain and simple. Make it easy for the finder of your dog to look at that tag and just using their eyes be able to find out the address where that dog's home is. Now, this particular tag has also got a statement that the dog has been microchipped. Well, naturally, that's great, but it isn't an exemption. Even if the dog is microchipped, the tag still needs to have the owner's name and address on it. So let's look at a third example of a tag. Now, in this one, the owner has got it right. So Camilla has complied with what this law requires, and so hopefully if Tricky Woo should ever stray, he can be returned quickly and easily. There are problems though with the collar and tag law. Tags can fall off. They can be removed. And if a dog has escaped from inside the home, then it may not have had the collar on at all. And some people don't like their details being displayed for the world to see, especially in these days of identity theft. And there's another excuse I hear from time to time. There is this myth that it increases the chances of your house being burgled if your name and address is on the tag. Well, the argument goes along the lines that the finder of your dog would then know that the dog isn't at home or that you're probably out looking for the dog, and so there's a greater chance of them coming round to burgle you. Well, in reality, I'm not so sure about this, and I really don't think there are prospective burglars scouring the streets looking for stray dogs. But there are some people who have a genuine concern about this. Another problem with this collar and tag law is that many dog owners simply don't know the law exists, and it is hardly ever prosecuted. So for one reason or another, this law is frequently disregarded, sometimes by otherwise highly responsible dog owners, which in my opinion is a shame. However, as there are so few prosecutions, it's not really about the detriment of enforcement, because in most cases there won't be any. Dog owners should adhere to this law because of the benefit of compliance. It increases the chances of getting a lost dog back home. So my advice is, put as much information on that tag as you can. Certainly put on your name and address as required by the law, but additionally put on your phone numbers and perhaps a statement that the dog has been microchipped. I appreciate you may need to get a bigger tag or perhaps even a second one. So let's now turn our attention to the proposed law on microchipping. Microchipping is a permanent form of identification. You'll realise already that the collar and tag law deals with owners, but when it comes to microchipping, by and large, we need to change terminology because we'll be looking at keepers. Under Section 12 of the Animal Welfare Act 2006, it states, the appropriate national authority may, by regulations, make such provision as the authority thinks fit for the purpose of promoting the welfare of animals for which a person is responsible. In England, the government has drafted the Microchipping of Dogs England Regulations 2015. It'll only apply to England, and it has a sunset clause, which means that the regulations will automatically lapse after 7 years, albeit if the regulations are working, then I'm sure they are likely to be renewed. There's a requirement on the Secretary of State to carry out a review of the regulations, and the first report must be published within 5 years. The regulations don't provide you with a right to assert that you own a dog because you've registered your name on the microchip database. So microchipping will continue to provide evidence of ownership, but it's not conclusive proof of ownership. The regulations themselves contain obligations on keepers, on breeders, on databases and implanters, which come into force on different dates. But the important date for the microchipping of dogs in England is by the 6th of April 2016. In DEFRA's impact assessment on the compulsory microchipping of dogs, they estimated that there were 7,310,000 dogs in England in 2013, and that as at that stage 66% of them were already microchipped. So a very good start, but still 1/3 of dogs need to be microchipped. The mandatory requirement to microchip dogs in England is due to come into effect on the 6th of April 2016. And if you're watching this and you've got a dog that hasn't yet been microchipped, then please get it done as soon as possible. Don't wait for this law to come in. Get the advantages of microchipping now. It increases the chances of a lost or stolen dog coming home. And it increases the speed at which that dog comes home, and it should also reduce the costs incurred in unnecessary kennelling fees. So let's try to work out what a keeper means for the purposes of these regulations. It's defined in Regulation 2. For a newborn puppy, the keeper is the owner of the bitch which gave birth to it. Curiously, that's the only time that the word owner is used in these regulations. For an assistance dog, it's the organisation responsible for its training and allocation until the dog has been retired. But for any other dog, the keeper is the person with whom it normally resides. So we're looking at the home of the dog. The definition says person, it doesn't say people. And so I take the view that a dog can only have one named keeper. In law, a company or a charity can be regarded as a legal entity, so a legal person. And so perhaps there's no reason why such a body can't be regarded as a keeper, provided that's where the dog normally resides. It may well be that guidance will be produced by DEFRA to confirm that in due course. There may also have to be a distinction drawn between someone who may well have possession of the dog, but they only have it on a transitory or a temporary basis. So here I'm thinking about perhaps a dog walker, maybe boarding kennels, perhaps a council pound, or maybe even a veterinary hospital. So they may well have possession of the dog, but perhaps not be regarded as the place where the dog normally resides. But how about the position with a rehoming centre? Well, at the moment, this is a bit unclear to me. Now, I would have thought that in many cases, a rescue is only going to have that dog on a temporary basis until they can find the dog a new forever home. And so they wouldn't really come under this definition of keeper. Yet perhaps it's a dog that's taken a time for a new home to be found, or maybe even it's a permanent resident at that rescue, in which case the rescue is probably going to be regarded as the keeper. Hopefully that's going to be something else that will be clarified by DEFRA in due course in guidance. How about a child? Can they be regarded as a keeper? Well, I'm not sure of the answer here either. Under Regulation 3, subsection 5, a dog is only regarded as microchipped where A a microchip which complies with Regulation 4 has been implanted in the dog, so that means that the chip itself must comply with certain requirements, and B, the details set out in Regulation 5 are recorded on a database by a database operator meeting the conditions set out in Regulation 6. So there are minimum requirements for the databases and what information must be kept on that database. So let's firstly look at the approved form of microchip, because the regulations really spell out what is an acceptable form of microchip for a dog, although in reality it's unlikely that keepers will have any problem with this, provided the supplier is reputable. But how will a keeper know? They'll be completely reliant on the implanter having done their homework and ensuring that the chip that they're using complies with these regulations. Now, this particular requirement will come in from the date the regulations come into force. And what it means is that if a dog has been microchipped, but the microchip itself doesn't comply with these standards, the dog won't be regarded as having been microchipped at all. Regulation 4 sets out that the microchip must have a unique number, which includes the manufacturer's code. It must be compliant with the specified ISO standards, that's 11784 of 1996 and 11785 of 1996, except for Annex A. And it must be readable by transponders, which operate at 134.2 kHz and conforms with the FDXB protocol set out in those ISO standards. If you're an implanter watching this, perhaps doing implanting for others, or even if you're a breeder implanting your own dogs before sale, then do please check that your microchip supplier is providing you with microchips that comply with these requirements. These requirements for the form of microchip are also being put into the Welfare of Racing Greyhounds Regulations 2010 and in the Docking of Working Dogs' Tails England Regulations 2007. So what information must be held by the database? It's in Regulation 5 and it sets out the minimum that's required that must be on the database from the 6th of April 2016. Although of course your particular database may choose to have more information if they wish to. And again, if this information isn't held on the database, then the dog will be regarded as not microchipped. So do please check that your database has the correct and up-to-date information. It's required to have the full name and address of the keeper. Now on that, I don't know what the position is for someone without a permanent home. Would a care of address be acceptable? The fact that the keeper is also the breeder. Now for this particular part of the regulations, breeder means any keeper of a bitch which whelps. Where applicable, it must have the breeder's licence number and the name of the council. Now this bit relates to a licensed breeder, where they need to be licensed with the local authority if they're running a business of breeding dogs for sale, or if they otherwise exceed the litter test of 5 or more litters in the last year. The database must also have the original name or the ID number given to the dog, and if different, the name given to the dog by its keeper. It's also got to have any contact telephone number if there is one for the keeper. It must also set out the sex of the dog, the breed of the dog, or a description if it's a crossbreed, also the dog's colour, the dog's date of birth or an estimate of its age, and last but not least, of course, it must also have the microchip number. The law will require you to notify the database if you move home or if you change your phone number. Otherwise, your dog won't be regarded as being microchipped. Please check with your database that your details are up to date. Do this as soon as possible. Please don't wait until this becomes law on the 6th of April 2016. If your details aren't current, at best you could be slowing down the process of getting a lost dog back home. and at worst, you might not even get your dog back at all. You may not be contactable. After the 6th of April 2016, there's an obligation on a new keeper to update the database with their full name, their address, and any contact telephone numbers, as well as any change in the dog's name. And that's under Regulation 8.1. Failure to do so would mean that the dog won't be regarded as microchipped. There's nothing to stop the original keeper from doing this on their behalf, but technically the obligation will be on the new keeper. A potential issue could arise if the original keeper won't consent to the database being updated, maybe because there's a dispute between the original keeper and the new keeper. Well, hopefully DEFRA will provide guidance on this aspect. And now if I can get out my wagging finger at this point for a cautionary tale. Rescues, I'm talking to you, because there are some rescues who like to retain ownership of a dog even once it's been rehomed to a new keeper. But please bear in mind, from the 6th of April 2016, the new keeper of the dog must have their details on the microchip database rather than the rescue. So, a rescue can technically continue to be the owner of the dog, even though the microchip database will have to have the keeper recorded as the person with whom that dog normally resides. There are many rescues who still have their details recorded on the databases for dogs that have long since been rehomed. And I strongly suggest that if you're watching this presentation and you're from a rescue in this position, or if you're a person who's got possession of a microchip dog which is still registered to a rescue, please contact your database and get this resolved sooner rather than later. Don't wait for the 6th of April 2016. There are also going to be legal requirements on the databases, and they'll come into force on the 6th of April 2015. Yes, a year before many other parts of this law. And they're set out in Regulation 6. And if a database fails to comply, then the Secretary of State may serve a notice telling them to stop holding themselves out as meeting these requirements, breach of which is a criminal offence punishable by a level 4 fine, which is currently up to £2,500. So when will a dog have to be microchipped? Have a look at Regulation 3.1. Microchipping will be required by the time a dog is 8 weeks old. But there are going to be some caveats to this. Under Regulation 3.2, a vet can certify that a dog shouldn't be microchipped for reasons of the animal's health. This must be done on a form to be approved by the Secretary of State, and it must state how long the vet believes the dog will be unfit. Under Regulation 8.2, it says that a keeper can't transfer a dog to a new keeper unless it's been microchipped. And just to remind you, a breeder will be considered the first keeper of a puppy, and so it will have to be microchipped prior to it going to a new home. What that means is that even if the dog is under 8 weeks old, the breeder must ensure the dog is microchipped and registered in their name with the database prior to it going to the new home. Some breeders have previously, they physically microchipped a dog, but they've not gone as far as to register the details with the database until they have the name of that new keeper. But under these new law provisions, they won't be allowed to wait like this. Under Regulation 3.3, an importer of a dog has 30 days to get it microchipped. Now, by saying a dog's been imported, this implies to me a degree of permanence. I'm not so sure what the position would be, perhaps for someone coming from other parts of Great Britain when they're only coming for a holiday. Say, for example, they've come down from Scotland for a short trip. Are they going to be regarded as an importer, and so they've got 30 days? Or are they going to be regarded as a keeper from the moment they arrive, albeit with a dog that normally resides out of the jurisdiction? Hopefully DEFRA will be able to confirm that. Confusingly, there is also an exclusion in Regulation 3.1b for a certified working dog. But don't get carried away. This does not mean that there's a general exemption for working dogs. For this part to apply, the dog has to have been certified for the purposes of Section 6.3 of the Animal Welfare Act 2006. And this refers to the limited occasions on which a working dog can lawfully have its tail docked, in which case, as part of the procedure, the law already requires that the dog is microchipped, but the requirement is by the age of 3 months. So this exemption in Regulation 3.1b only means that if the dog is a working dog and has been lawfully docked, then the keeper has a bit of extra time to get it microchipped, as rather than by 8 weeks, it has to be done by the age of 3 months. Regulation 9 sets out who can implant a microchip. And it'll say that no person will be able to implant a microchip unless they're a vet or a vet nurse acting under the direction of a vet, or they're a student vet or a student vet nurse acting under the direction of a vet. Now this phrase, under the direction of a vet, that's interpreted in paragraph 18.5, and that's in the supporting guidance to the Code of Professional Conduct for veterinary surgeons. And that means that they've been instructed on the tasks to be performed, but the vet doesn't necessarily have to be present. However, it's not just vets, vet nurses or the students who can implant. Grandfather rights are being given to implanters provided they received implanting training before these regulations came into force, and provided that that training included practical experience of implanting a microchip. So if you've already been trained by the time this particular part of the regulation comes into force, then you're probably okay to continue. Otherwise, you have to be satisfactorily assessed on a training course approved by the Secretary of State for that purpose. It will be a criminal offence to implant a dog unless you come within these provisions, and it's punishable by a level 2 fine, which is currently up to £500. Even if you have grandfather rights, or even if you've attended the approved training course, if the Secretary of State believes you're not implanting to a satisfactory standard, you can be prevented from continuing at all, or perhaps until you receive additional training. Adverse reactions are dealt with in Regulation 10. I accept that nothing is completely foolproof, and even though it's regarded that the benefits of microchipping considerably outweigh the tiny risk involved, it's only right that the regulations deal with the very rare occasions when things go wrong. If a microchip fails, so perhaps it can't be read on a scanner, if it moves from where it was implanted, so it migrates, or if there's a condition which appears to have been caused by the implanting of a microchip, it's important that this is reported to the Secretary of State, and in fact it'll be a legal requirement. Hopefully this won't happen very often, and it's likely that it'll be the veterinary profession who will be the ones who will pick up on any problems of this nature. Failure to report an adverse reaction that you've identified is a criminal offence, punishable by a fine of currently up to £500. I wouldn't anticipate there'll be many prosecutions for this, but perhaps those who scan dogs, as well as vets, as well as keepers, need to be aware of these new legal requirements to report adverse reactions. Otherwise, potentially, it will be a criminal offence. Well, as we've reached that stage, let's look at enforcement, because I doubt if there are going to be hordes of enforcers grabbing every dog they see so that they can scan it. So I really doubt there's going to be a great deal of enforcement. It seems to me it's going to be similar to collar and tag. It's about the benefits of compliance rather than looking at the detriment of enforcement. And this is actually reflected in the government's own documents. If you look at DEFRA's impact assessment on compulsory microchipping, it came out on the 3rd of March 2014. They said, "It is expected that enforcement will be restricted to irresponsible owners whose dogs have been allowed to cause a problem, such as fouling, causing a nuisance, or out of control. It is also likely to be used in cruelty cases or cases of unlicensed breeding. Any enforcement action is likely to be part of a wider action." And they went on to say, actions on just failing to microchip will be very few. There's no provision for any of the offences created by these regulations to be enforced by a fixed penalty notice. Unlike the collar and tag law, there will be a wide variety of enforcers who have the power to enforce these regulations. If you look at Regulation 11, it says that they can be enforced by a local authority, so that's looking at borough or district level rather than a parish council, or by someone authorised by them. They can be enforced by a police constable, they can be enforced by a police community support officer, or they can be enforced by someone who's authorised by the Secretary of State. These are all regarded as authorised persons for the purposes of the regulations. I anticipate that in the majority of cases where there is a breach of this law, it'll be one of three things. It'll perhaps be a case where the breeder has transferred a dog without it being microchipped, or a keeper has possession of a dog which hasn't been microchipped, or the details aren't up to date for the keeper. For the breeder's breach, yes, that can be prosecuted. It's a criminal offence contrary to Regulation 8.2 as well as 13.2a, where it's a level 2 fine, which means it's currently up to £500. But of course, this is only likely to be enforced if the keeper comes forward to make a complaint against a breeder who hasn't complied with that requirement. For the keeper's breaches, so that would be having a dog that's not microchipped or not having the details up to date on the database, then although, yes, it's a requirement, it isn't an immediate criminal offence to fail to comply. In either situation, the dog won't be regarded as having been microchipped because it doesn't comply with the requirements of Regulation 3.5. There's provision in Regulation 12C for an authorised officer to take possession of a dog without the consent of the keeper to check if a dog is microchipped. Albeit there doesn't seem to be a provision to obtain a warrant if the dog at the time is inside someone's home. And of course, once a dog has been scanned, it's going to have to be returned back to the keeper. Under Regulation 12A, an authorised person may serve on the keeper a notice requiring the keeper to have the dog microchipped within 21 days. You can't prosecute a keeper for these breaches unless that notice has been served. If they comply with the notice, that will be the end of the enforcement. The government clearly expects compliance in most cases. It's referred to in their impact assessment, which says this: responsible owners who are likely to obey any notice upon them should not add any significant caseloads to the CPS and the courts. It's only if there's non-compliance with the notice that it'll then become a criminal offence, and that's going to be contrary to Regulation 12A and 13E, where again it's a level 2 fine, which is currently up to £500. In addition to a prosecution, or perhaps instead of a prosecution, if there's non-compliance with the notice, then an authorised person has the power to take possession of a dog and arrange for it to be microchipped, and they can claim the cost. But again, there's no specific provision to obtain a warrant if the dog's in the home at the time. In any event, that may well deal with the implanting of the dog, but I'm not as clear how they can enforce the requirement to update the database. Well, yes, it can be prosecuted, but can the enforcer require the database to be updated? I'm not quite sure how, but perhaps again, DEFRA will be able to clarify that in guidance. The regulations also make it a separate offence to obstruct an authorised officer. I do anticipate that there will be guidance issued to enforcers to particularly assist them with this part of the regulations. So let's look at the position with vets. Under the regulations, there will be no legal requirement on anyone to scan a dog, whether that be a vet, dog warden or a rescue. And I know that's going to be a disappointment to some campaigners who particularly wanted a requirement for all vets to scan dogs. But it seems to me that before any dog is implanted with a microchip, it remains common sense for an implanter to check that a dog hasn't already been microchipped. And I'm quite sure that dog wardens and rescues will invariably scan a dog that's a stray or one that comes in for rehoming. But looking particularly at the position with vets, ownership disputes are discussed in the supporting guidance to the Code of Professional Conduct for veterinary surgeons. As vets are in a particularly difficult position with client confidentiality, if a client should bring a dog in, which on being scanned is found to be chipped in somebody else's name. If the client refuses to consent to their details being released, then the advice given in paragraph 1425 is that the vet should contact the registered keeper and or the database provider and explain that the animal has been brought in by someone else. However, the veterinary surgeon should not release the current keeper's personal information to the registered keeper or any other third party, including the database provider, at this stage. It goes on to say in paragraph 1427 that what the vet chooses to do will depend on whether it's a criminal or a civil dispute. If the dog has been stolen, then the police should be notified and the details of the client passed on to them. Whereas if perhaps it's an ownership dispute, so a civil case, perhaps between former partners, then the guidance is that the client's details should only be given to a lawyer or legal advisor advising on the recovery of the dog. If you are a vet or a vet nurse and you've got any concerns at all, please check out the latest position with your professional body. I do want everyone who's watching this presentation to have a look at the website www.chipmydog.org.uk, as it's a one-stop shop provided by Dogs Trust for microchipping. If you haven't already got your dog microchipped, then do please get on with it. I know I've said it before in this presentation, but I'm very happy to keep on repeating it. Don't wait for it to become law. The website contains details of all of the events and locations being offered by Dogs Trust where a dog can be microchipped for free. There are also details of participating vets on their Microchipping Through Vet scheme. They'll also microchip dogs for free until that part of the campaign ends at the end of March 2015. If you've already got your dog microchipped, you may well want to check that your details are up to date on your database. And if it needs updating, then again, please get on with it. don't wait for this to become law either. If you don't know which database you're registered with, then ask your vet to scan your dog, as with that microchip number, you can use a search facility on chipmydog.org.uk to find out which database you need to contact. And to make it easy, it even has the phone numbers for all of the current databases. The website also provides practical advice on what to do if you've lost your dog and the steps you should take if you've found a dog straying. So, in summary, stray dogs are still a problem, and I want all stray dogs to be returned home with all due speed. The current law on collar and tag isn't working, but I still encourage all dog owners, please comply with your existing requirements by law, which is the name and address of the owner on the collar or on a plate or badge attached to it. Compulsory microchipping is coming. It doesn't replace collar and tag, it's in addition to collar and tag. And I've tried to give you a summary on what the regulations contain, as well as some of the implications for breeders, for keepers, for rescues, for vets, as well as enforcers. I hope this presentation has been useful, but do please check the notes to find out if there have been any updates since this was filmed. If you want to know more about dangerous dogs laws or the law on nuisance dogs, then I have separate DVDs available. Big sell here. Order forms can be downloaded from www.doglaw.co.uk. And you can also get information from that website on how to book me to give talks on the law on dogs. Now, in the rest of this DVD, you've not finished yet, I've got a group of experts giving us the benefit of their opinion on how this law is going to work. We'll be hearing from Celia Wilson from PetLog, that's the UK's largest lost and found database for microchip pets. We'll be hearing from Sarah Fry from Pet ID, she's one of the microchip suppliers, and Sarah also trains implanters. And she's also going to be giving us a practical demonstration on best practice on how to scan a dog for the presence of a microchip. And we'll also be hearing from Neil Burton, the chairman of the National Dog Wardens Association, with his views on the benefits of microchipping. Thank you. What would you say are the main advantages in having a dog microchipped?
If a dog goes missing and it hasn't got a collar and tag on, or it loses its collar and tag, that dog is totally unidentifiable without a microchip. The microchip is giving that animal an option of, or the opportunity of being reunited with the owner. The crux of the matter there is that the owner must make sure that the details that relate to that microchip on the database are kept up to date, and sadly a lot of animals are found, they are scanned, and the information found to be relating to that microchip is out of date, and then the microchip is no use to reuniting that dog with the owner or the keeper. So therefore it is important that not only is the animal scanned correctly, but the information on that database is kept up to date, and then we do have a very good success rate of reuniting pets with their keepers. I mean, the whole purpose that microchipping was introduced back in 1989, all those years ago, was that the figures of strays, certainly within the UK, were horrific at that time, and there seemed to be no means of marrying up people looking for their pets and pets being lost. And over the last 25 years, you know, we've had a significant success at reuniting pets with their owners because of the use of the microchip. You can never tell when your dog's going to run out of that, run across that park, or somebody's going to let the dog out of the front garden, back garden, or anywhere else. So I would suggest get the microchip in your dog as soon as possible. There's no reason that you need to wait until legislation in 2016, my advice would be to have your dog microchipped as soon as possible.
So can you explain what is a microchip?
A microchip is a little implantable device like the one I've got in the palm of my hand. It works by using radio wave. The chip itself is completely passive, so it's totally inert, no power source, no battery, no nothing, but it gets activated by an external scanner that gets passed over the animal that's implanted, and it uses radio wave to work with. The microchip itself has no battery in it. It's completely passive, so therefore it has indefinite lifespan. It's the scanner that does all the work. So it's a scanner that gets passed over the microchip, emitting a radio wave, and the microchip is tuned to exactly the same radio wave. When the two come into contact with each other, so when the scanner's passed over the microchip is woken up, if you like. It takes a split second to wake up, and then the scanner then displays the unique number that the microchip's been programmed with on the LCD of the scanner. And then the person that's operating the scanner can then obviously deal with the microchip number and the consequent response that they need to make with regard to looking on the registration database. Every single microchip has a completely unique number. The number coding system is quite complicated. It either works on a manufacturer's system where each manufacturer has their own prefix to the microchip, and then the rest of the number is the identification number. Or some countries around the world operate on a country-coded system where the government actually control the issuing out of number sequences, and therefore the first few digits of the number indicates the country of origin rather than the manufacturer who's actually produced that microchip.
How safe is it to implant a microchip in a dog?
We've been microchipping companion animals in the United Kingdom now for over 25 years. Very successfully, but prior to it being introduced with companion animals, it was used around the world with exotics and conservation projects. So some of the most rare and endangered species around the world were actually microchipped prior to it being used within companion animals. So it's a very well-established means of identification now, and we've been very successful in reuniting pets, in particular in the UK and elsewhere around the world, over the last 25 years.
Does implanting hurt the dog?
The implantation is like giving an injection. It's like giving a vaccination. And just as humans react slightly differently, sometimes when they're having a vaccination or an injection or having a blood test or something, some animals react slightly differently. But I would say the vast majority of occasions, it's a relatively pain-free experience. I've been working in the industry 25 years, and very rarely do we have anything of a reaction. The needles are incredibly sharp, and they're shaped in such a way to allow the needle to be injected in underneath the skin very quickly, very simply. And what I always sort of say to people is a simple injection, gives lifetime protection. So it's a couple of seconds of discomfort to hopefully prevent that animal from going through the discomfort of being held as a stray and possibly put to sleep because the owners can't be found.
In the draft regulations, it says that dogs will have to be chipped by the age of 8 weeks, or perhaps even sooner if they're transferred by the breeder. Isn't it possible that some breeds are just going to be too small to be microchipped?
Some breeds, obviously, some of the toy breeds are, significantly smaller than a lot of dogs out there. But at the end of the day, we microchip regularly very small furries within the industry of conservation, tiny little harvest mice and dormice and what have you. So, there are things for the very tiny breeds now. There are small microchips. There are slightly known as mini chips, and they have a slightly narrower gauge needle, which some breeders prefer. And then we've got the regular microchips for all other breeds and species. So it's, those puppies are still going to have to be vaccinated. So the discomfort that they might have just for a couple of seconds while a microchip's popped in is really going to be no different to them having a vaccination. And, so therefore there isn't a problem. Microchip implanters are trained to implant animals of all different shapes and sizes. So the procedure that they carry out is just done in accordance with the size of the puppy or the kitten or whatever it is that they're actually implanting. It's really important that the implanter is properly trained to implant, so whether it be a vet, a veterinary nurse, a dog warden, a breeder, somebody that works in animal welfare or control, they should all be given instruction of how to microchip all species that they're allowed to. Obviously, with regard to companion animals, lay people are only allowed to do companion animals. They're not allowed to do more exotic species and horses, for example. But certainly for the companion animals, so cats, dogs, rabbits and ferrets, anyone that wants to take part in microchipping needs to go on a proper microchipping training course or be instructed directly by a veterinary surgeon. A dog should be scanned by anyone in animal welfare or dog control once they pick the animal up to identify whether there's a microchip present or not. Equally, if a dog or any other animal is presented for microchipping to be microchipped, then it should be scanned first, because it may be that the person's presenting the animal isn't the first owner, or they might have forgotten they've already had the animal microchipped. It might be a partner in a relationship who didn't realise the other partner had already had the dog or cat or whatever microchipped. The animal could be presented, it could end up being a stolen animal or someone that's acquired the animal through less honest means, possibly, either that they knew about or that they didn't know about. Equally, if a vet practice has a customer that brings an animal that's new to them to the practice that they haven't seen at the practice before, it's really important that the vet scan that animal as soon as possible to determine whether it's already got a microchip in it, and not just assume that it needs to be microchipped. It may well be that it's already got one and then it needs to be identified as well. It's very, very simple. It just takes a few seconds normally to identify whether the presence of a microchip is there, but it is important that it's done thoroughly so that you identify the site where we microchip in the UK, which is in between the shoulder blades and where most of the rest of the world microchip, but also on the continent, they microchip on the left flank of the neck. So when we do a microchip scan, it's important that it's a good, thorough, slow, deliberate body scan, which we're going to demonstrate shortly. This is Bonnie. She's an 8-year-old Rottweiler. She's a rescue from Ireland, and her microchip, as I say, is sitting exactly where it should be, in between her shoulder blades. But with a larger breed of dog, it's important that the technique that we follow is exactly the same as whether it's a small breed, but we just do a very slow, deliberate massaging motion up the back of the neck, across the shoulder blades, down both legs, underneath the tummy, onto the front of the chest, back up and round. And what happens with most scanners is that they have a time period of about 20-30 seconds that they'll scan for in order to save battery. Once you get to that not found point, it's very important that you hear the beep on the scanner and press the scanning button again to make sure that all the time that you are thinking that you're scanning, the scanner is actually working. And to have the scanner in contact with the body of the animal rather than waving it around. And that means that the radio wave is penetrating as deep as possible, because Bonnie could have been microchipped when she was a young puppy, and she's obviously grown since she was a young puppy. That microchip could be sitting several centimetres in the tissue now, and if I've got the scanner airy-fairily above the coat, I'm simply not going to energise that microchip. The amount of energy that it's going to take with an average scanner, the read distance is about 6 or 7 centimetres to be able to read a microchip. So in order to maximise the opportunity of picking that microchip up, we want to have the scanner as near as possible to the body of the dog. And this would be the same if it was a small breed or large breed. We want to carry out the same procedure to make sure that we've got the best possible opportunity of picking that microchip up. Good girl, good girl.
What would you say are the benefits of microchipping?
The benefits of microchipping are that it's a unique 15-digit number which provides permanent identification for the dog. So once implanted, it's with the dog for its life. Microchipping does not provide absolute proof of ownership of a dog. Microchipping is there to reunite a lost dog with its keeper.
What does a microchip database do?
Good question. I think a lot of people aren't aware of what the microchip database does because we tend to be quite invisible until we're needed. But essentially we record the details of the microchip, the details of the dog and the keeper's information, and we're there 24/7, 365, so that if a dog is found and scanned, an authorised user will contact us to retrieve the information to actually reunite the dog with the owner. And of course we have a good relationship with the keepers of the dogs because if they need to keep their details up to date, they're interacting with the database as well.
How many microchip databases are there at present in the UK?
There's currently 6 databases in the UK at present. So ourselves at Petlog, there's Anybase, Avid, Pet Protect, Pet Identity and SmartChip. I would say they all work very similarly because the processes that we deal with, which is registration and reunification, are essentially the same.
What information is contained on the database for each dog and its keeper?
Well, from the unique 15-digit number of the microchip, we actually assign that to the details of the dog, so the dog's name, the breed, whether it's a dog or a bitch, the age or the date of birth if that's available, colour's important as well and any special features, and also the full contact details of the keeper. The information should be transmitted to the database really from the implanter. So from the point of microchipping, the implanter is making sure they've got all the relevant information from the keeper of the dog, and they can either then submit that online or through a practice management system or actually send the details in on paperwork to us. We always advise keepers to check that they do receive something from the implanter. So from the moment the dog's actually microchipped, they should be handed something. It's normally a postcard or a wallet with the unique microchip number on, and the information then is also there to inform them that if an email address has been given, they will get confirmation of the registration within 24 hours, or they will get a postal confirmation from the database within 10 to 14 days. And if the keeper doesn't receive that, they need to follow that up with the implanter and the database. If the implanter actually hands the information to the keeper, we don't suggest that's the right process, but as long as the keeper gets that to the database as soon as possible, the database will advise accordingly.
In what circumstances would a keeper need to have contact with the database?
The keeper needs to contact the database if they are changing any of their details, and most importantly they need to contact the database if they do lose their pet. This is really important because it's a time then to remind everybody to ensure that all the contact details are up to date. The databases can flag the record and it will assist with a speedy reunification once the pet is found.
How would a keeper know what their dog's microchip number is?
Well, hopefully they have received something from the point of implantation and hopefully they've kept it somewhere very safe. But if they haven't done that, their vet or their welfare centre will be able to always scan the dog and actually let them know what the microchip number is.
If the worst should happen and a dog is lost or stolen, what advice would you give to a keeper?
This is a very stressful circumstance for a keeper of a dog if it's lost or stolen. In the first instance, if it's lost, please tell the database because we can give some really helpful information. If the dog is actually stolen and there's a crime reference, it's really important that the database have that information so they can assist the police as well. Once we've had the report, we can actually email out a list of really useful information such as contacting the dog warden, contacting the local authority and putting posters up, because I think when you're stressed it's hard to take in a lot of information on the phone and it's nice to be able to read that. And there's also some really good information on all the websites.
If a lost dog does turn up, how is that notified to the keeper?
Well, an authorised agent, and it will normally be the dog warden, a vet or a welfare centre, will have the animal. They will scan the animal to check first if it does have a microchip, and then they will contact the appropriate database to retrieve the details of the keeper, and they are then responsible for contacting that keeper, and that's normally by phone.
Say a dog is jointly owned by a couple. How will they decide whose name is going to be put on the database as the keeper of that dog?
It really is for the couple to decide who is going to be the named keeper on the database. The database will recommend we have one named keeper, and that's the keeper that has the responsibility for the pet. But most databases have a process where there can be additional contact details held on the record, and I think the couple just need to decide what's appropriate for them.
If a keeper is going on holiday, can they contact the database and have additional details put on for their contact details, or perhaps a second name person put on who can be contacted whilst they're away?
Most databases have some services which allow keepers to add additional contact information, temporary contact information and holiday information. And the purpose of microchipping is to reunite the pet with its owner. So we advise that if people are travelling, they do take up these services with the database so that we always know where you and the dog are.
Who has access to the information on the database?
The information that is held on the database in relation to the microchip is held in a very secure environment, and the only people who have access to that data are the keeper themselves for their own personal record, and a group of people we class as authorised agents. Now, authorised agents can be the dog warden, the vets, the welfare centre, the police, and they all have a very secure PIN and password that is authenticated with the databases and is checked for every inquiry, and a log made against the record.
Why is it so important that a keeper makes sure that their details are kept up to date?
The purpose of the microchipping is to reunite a lost pet with its keeper, and therefore it's paramount that keepers keep their details up to date with the database so that we can actually do this quickly and efficiently.
Why is it that the databases make a charge for keeping the details updated?
I think the database service is often unseen and misunderstood, but if I explain it in a three-step process, which is that there's the actual implantation of the microchip. So there's a relationship between the implanter and the keeper, and the fee paid there is for the actual implantation of the chip into the dog. The next step is the registration on the database and the aftercare service that the database provides, which is the 24/7 365 reunification service. And the third step is the responsibility of the keeper to keep their details up to date. And because the fees associated with the running of the database are not included at the point of microchipping, the databases then have to make a small fee or charge for any amendments that need to happen further down the line. And again, most databases offer a process whereby at the point of registration, the keeper is given a choice to either stay on a basic service or upgrade to a lifetime membership service, which then does cover all the costs associated with the lifetime running, all the changes of addresses and the extra services. So in most cases, it averages out about £1 a year for the life of the dog.
How easy is it for someone to find out which database their dog is registered with?
Well, hopefully from the point of implantation, they had some paperwork which very clearly said which database they're on, or they would have received the confirmation from that database. But if keepers have lost paperwork or dogs have been passed on, it is actually very easy to actually not know what database you're on. But all the databases have worked together, and we do all offer a service on our homepage, which is a very quick chip check. You can go to any of the databases, enter the microchip number, and it will advise which database is holding the contact details for that record.
If a keeper moves or changes their phone number, what's the process for having that database updated?
If a keeper moves or changes their phone numbers, there are many ways they can update the database. We've tried to make it really simple. For those people who like apps, Petlog have a really good My Dog app, and therefore they can literally change their details in their pocket anytime they like. They can go online and change their details. They can send in paperwork, or they can call us.
If someone's bought a dog, their obligation will be to make sure that the dog is registered in their name. How would they go about updating the database in those circumstances?
If you've bought a dog from a breeder, the breeder will actually be able to assist you with that, because the breeder will have the original paperwork and they should pass that over either for the new keeper to send in, or most breeders will probably send it in on behalf of the new keeper. If the dog perhaps has come to you through other routes, we do advise that you seek a sign-off from the original keeper if you're in contact with them, and particularly if they've got the existing paperwork, that can be used. But if none of that's available, all the databases have a process where you can contact the database. They will advise you of the process. It's called a transfer of keeper process. Many will send out a form, or the forms can be downloaded from the websites. There are disclaimers on the forms which need to be read and understood, and then the transfer keeper form can be filled in. There is a payment to be made with that. Once that's actually received by the database, that process will take place.
The regulations will provide for minimum standards for the databases themselves. Do you think that's a good thing?
The obligations that have been placed on the databases, I feel, are really important. The databases are pivotal to the success of microchipping, because we provide the 24/7 reunification service. We're holding keepers' personal contact details, and therefore there needs to be a minimum standard of operation. We've been in operation for 20 years at Petlog, so we know the processes that work and the ones that don't work, and we are able then to provide guidance to any new databases coming on board as to what those minimum standards are and how best to achieve them for the success of microchipping all over, but really.
Now, at the present time, some rescue centres won't transfer the details on the database when a dog is rehomed. When the new law comes into force, will that practice have to change?
Well, the regulations state that the dog should be registered to the keeper of the dog, so that's where the dog normally resides. So we would advise that the rescues, if they can, contact their previous customers to advise them to ensure that they do need to update these details. And we will be doing lots of education to advise people to check that the dogs that they have at home are actually in their keepership. And there is a very simple process. Again, it's the transfer keeper process that would need to take place.
Will breeders' practices have to change as well?
Well, the breeder will be responsible for chipping the dog at 8 weeks before it goes to the new keeper, and they will need to be named on the record before that record is transferred to the new keeper. So this is a change for many breeders who I think currently today tend to chip and hold the registration so that they put it straight into the new keeper's name.
What are the main duties of a dog warden?
Well, there are several roles, but the main statutory role is to deal with stray dogs within the council area, obviously the area that the dog warden works for that council. The main other roles are promoting responsible dog ownership through a combination of education and enforcement. So obviously the whole community can kind of live in harmony with dogs.
So if a dog warden's picked up a stray dog and it's found to be microchipped, what's the next step? How do you find out who the keeper of that dog is?
Well, the process is scan the dog, obtain the microchip number, then you contact the database, and when you're speaking to the operator at the database, they'll ask you for a PIN number, which is obviously specific to each local authority. You give that and some other information, and the operator then knows that they're dealing with a bona fide organisation, and then they release the details of the that are kept on the microchip.
How important do you think it is that a keeper makes sure that the database is up to date with their current phone number and current address?
Well, it's imperative really, because otherwise you can be seizing a dog as a stray. You scan it, you think, great, it's got a microchip. You ring the database, it could actually have out-of-date details, or it could be details for a foreign country, or even it could be microchipped, but the details have not been registered, so the microchip doesn't do anything.
Would you say that a collar and tag for a dog still has a purpose?
Yeah, there's an important requirement for a collar and tag to remain in conjunction with microchipping, perhaps, because if a member of the public finds a dog in the street with a collar and tag on, yep, they can just probably contact them or think, oh, it's just round the corner, I'll take the dog back, because not everybody's got access to a scanner, microchip scanner. So even if the dog is microchipped, the collar and tag will obviously assist in the dog being reunited as well.